There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. For a man buried alive, the greatest horror is not the darkness or the lack of air, but the terror of the mind turning on itself. Tonight, we join Jack in his coffin for a vision that is either a message from a fellow victim or a final, cruel hallucination. There is a darkness beneath the earth, a blackness that is more than just the absence of light. It is a presence, a solid and suffocating entity that has waited patiently for millennia. For Jack, a man whose life had been a careless succession of bright, noisy rooms and easy laughter, this ancient darkness was now his entire universe. His world had shrunk to the length and breadth of a cheap wooden coffin, a premature tomb 6 feet beneath the cold, indifferent soil of the St. Giles churchyard. The cruel prank, the final, unforgivable act of his so-called friends from the Wonder Club, had become a death sentence. The memory of their shovels, of the rain of dirt, of the final, crushing weight, was a fading, nightmarish blur. The reality was this: the rough, splintered wood against his back, the unyielding lid just inches from his face, and the slow, agonizing certainty of his own impending death. He was a man who had made a foolish wager on his own courage, and he had lost in the most spectacular and horrifying way imaginable. His first battle was against panic. It rose in his throat like a hot, sour bile, a primal, animal scream for air and light and life. But the scream had nowhere to go. It was born and died in the space of a single choked breath, a useless, muffled sound that only served to remind him of the absolute finality of his prison. He was sealed. He was entombed. He was, for all intents and purposes, already dead. The world above, the world of wind and stars and drunken, laughing friends, might as well have been a different dimension. After the first, frantic, and utterly futile struggle against his wooden cage, a grim and terrible calm began to settle over him. He knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a condemned man, that every frantic movement, every ragged, panicked breath, was a foolish waste of the one resource he had left: the stale, thin, and rapidly diminishing supply of air trapped in the coffin with him. He had to husband it, to stretch out these final, precious moments of consciousness for as long as he possibly could. His world became one of pure, raw sensory deprivation, a void that his mind, desperate for stimulus, began to fill with its own horrors. The first and most absolute sensation was the darkness. It was a perfect, seamless black, a physical weight against his open eyes. He could not tell if they were open or closed. The view was the same. It was a blackness that was not empty, but full of pressure, of confinement, of the suffocating presence of his own impending end. It was the darkness of the womb and the tomb, the beginning and the end, and he was trapped within it. Then there was the silence. The grave was a place of profound, almost holy quiet. The world of sound had been completely erased. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant cry of an animal. All of it was filtered out by the 6 feet of heavy, damp earth that lay between him and the living world. The silence was so absolute that his own body became a symphony of noise. The frantic, terrified pounding of his heart was a deafening drumbeat against his ribs. The rushing, tidal roar of the blood in his ears was as loud as a waterfall. He could hear the soft, wet click of his own swallowing, the faint, dry rasp of his own breathing. He was a single, noisy, biological machine, and the silence of the grave was a vast, empty auditorium in which his own death was the only performance. But his solitude, his final, lonely terror, was not to last. As he lay there, his mind drifting on the edge of a panic he was struggling to suppress, a new horror introduced itself. It was a sound that did not come from his own body. It was a sound that had no right to exist in the dead, silent world of the grave. It was a slow, steady, rhythmic knocking. Tap, tap,
Top.
It was coming from the side, from the thin, wooden wall of his coffin, just inches from his head. It was a sound that was both faint and impossibly terrifyingly clear. It was a sound of purpose, of intent. It was a signal, and it was coming from the coffin buried next to his. The fragile dam of his sanity, already weakened by fear and lack of oxygen, finally broke. A new wave of terror, a cold, sharp, and intelligent fear, washed over him, completely eclipsing the simple, animal fear of his own suffocation. He was not alone. The knocking was a relentless, patient rhythm in the dark. It was the sound of a nightmare made real. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of his oxygen-starved brain. But it was too real, too consistent. It was a steady, metronomic beat that seemed to be counting down the seconds to something far worse than a simple, quiet death. He was trapped, 6 feet under the ground, in a box with no hope of escape, and someone or something in the box next to him knew he was there. The terror of his premature burial was now compounded by the infinitely greater terror of his supernatural neighbor. The darkness was no longer empty. The silence was no longer absolute. His tomb was no longer private. The final, horrifying piece of his new reality had clicked into place. He was not going to die alone. The rhythmic, insistent knocking from the adjacent coffin became a form of torture, a maddening counterpoint to the frantic, panicked drumming of Jack's own heart. Each tap, tap, tap was a nail being hammered into the lid of his sanity. He tried to block it out, pressing his hands to his ears, but in the close, suffocating confines of the coffin, the sound seemed to vibrate directly through the wood and into his skull. It was inescapable, a constant, terrifying reminder that he was not alone in his subterranean prison. But a new, more immediate, and far more primal enemy was beginning to make its presence felt. The air in the coffin was turning to poison. His body, the very machine that was creating the loud, frantic sounds of its own terror, began to fail. It started with his breathing. The shallow, controlled sips of air he had been forcing himself to take gave way to deep, desperate, and useless gasps. His lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that simply wasn't there. The air he drew in was hot, stale, and thick with the carbon dioxide of his own exhalations. Each breath was less satisfying than the last, a futile attempt to draw life from a well that had run dry. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a light-headed, floating sensation that made the crushing, physical reality of the coffin feel strangely distant. His limbs, which had been tense and rigid with fear, began to feel heavy, disconnected, as if they were made of lead. He tried to raise a hand to touch his face, to confirm he was still there, but the effort was monumental. His arm felt like a dead weight he could barely command. He was losing control of his own physical form, his muscles refusing the frantic, panic signals from his brain. Then came the lights. In the perfect, absolute blackness of his tomb, tiny, sparkling points of light began to appear before his eyes. They were like a sprinkle of diamond dust, a faint, ethereal constellation of dying stars. He knew what they were. It was a sign of hypoxia, the final protest of a brain being starved of the very element it needed to function. His body was shutting down. The biological clock was nearing its final tick. Death was no longer an abstract terror. It was a physical process, and he was a helpless passenger on its final, inexorable journey. As his body began its surrender, a strange and unexpected thing happened to his mind. The sharp, white-hot terror that had been his constant companion began to recede. The frantic, screaming panic softened, its sharp edges blurring. It was replaced by a strange, dreamlike lethargy, a profound and almost pleasant sense of detachment. The crushing weight of the coffin lid, the suffocating thickness of the air, the maddening, rhythmic knocking from next door, it all began to feel distant, unimportant, like the details of a half-remembered nightmare. The boundary between the waking world and the world of dreams, between consciousness and unconsciousness, was beginning to dissolve. He was drifting, floating in a warm, gray, and silent sea. The darkness was no longer a threat. It was a comfort, a soft, velvet blanket wrapping him in a final, peaceful embrace. He was dying, and a part of him, the part that was exhausted from the sheer effort of being terrified, welcomed it. It was in this hazy, liminal state, this quiet, gray borderland between life and death, that he heard the new sound. It was not the sharp, percussive tap, tap, tap from the neighboring coffin. That sound, which had been the focus of his terror, had faded away, or perhaps his dying brain had simply ceased to process it. This new sound was different. It was soft, gentle, and achingly sad. It was the whisper of a woman's voice. It was not a sound he heard with his ears. Like the knocking before it, it seemed to manifest directly inside his head, a thought that was not his own. The voice was faint, as if carried on a great wind from a vast distance, but it was clear, and it was filled with a profound, heart-breaking sorrow. It did not speak words, not at first. It was just a sound, a soft, musical sigh of grief, a lament for a sorrow too deep to be contained in language. The sound was beautiful and it was terrifying. It was a sound that did not belong in the ugly, brutal reality of his tomb. It was a sound from another place, another world, and yet it was achingly, hauntingly familiar. His dying mind, now untethered from the anchor of logic and the immediate reality of his predicament, began to drift through his own memories. It bypassed the recent, ugly memories, the drunken bravado of the club, the leering faces of his friends, the horror of the falling dirt. It drifted further back, searching for the source of that familiar, sorrowful voice. And then it found it, like a single, bright star appearing in a cloudy night sky. A memory pierced through the gathering fog of his impending death. A face, a name, Molly. The name echoed in the silence of his mind, and with it came a flood of sensation and memory. Molly, a young woman he had known, had courted, had perhaps even loved in his own careless, shallow way. He saw her face, not as a vague impression, but with a sudden, vivid clarity. He saw her bright, intelligent eyes, the way her smile would always start in her eyes before it reached her lips. He remembered the sound of her laughter, a sound like wind chimes on a summer afternoon. He remembered the scent of her hair, like lavender and rain. And then he remembered the end of her story, her sudden, tragic death some months before. A sickness, they had said, a swift and unexpected fever that had taken her in the prime of her youth. He remembered the funeral, a grim, rainy affair. He remembered the hollow, empty feeling of a world that had suddenly been deprived of a small but significant light. He had grieved, in his own way, but his grief had been shallow, selfish, quickly forgotten in the endless, noisy pursuit of his own amusement. Now, here, in the final moments of his own life, her memory returned to him with a force and clarity that was overwhelming. The sorrowful, whispering voice in his head was her voice. He knew it with a certainty that defied all reason. He was not just dying in a coffin. He was dying while being haunted by the memory of the woman he had failed to properly love. It was a final, poetic, and exquisitely cruel twist of fate. The vision began to solidify. The darkness in his mind was no longer just a passive void. It was becoming a stage. The whispering voice was a summons, a calling. His mind, in its final, desperate act, was not just remembering Molly. It was conjuring her. It was preparing a final, beautiful, and heartbreaking vision to shield him from the ugly, squalid reality of his own pathetic end. He was about to be granted a final, comforting hallucination, a merciful madness to ease his passage into the great, silent dark, and he welcomed it. The absolute, suffocating blackness of the coffin, which had been Jack's entire universe, began to change. It was a subtle shift at first, a change in the quality of the darkness itself. The heavy, oppressive weight of the void seemed to lessen, and the impenetrable black began to soften at the edges, turning to a deep, velvety charcoal gray. He was no longer in a coffin 6 feet beneath the earth. He was floating in a peaceful twilight limbo, the hazy, dreamlike state between worlds. And then a light began to grow. It did not shine from above, from the world he had left behind. It was born from within the darkness that surrounded him, from within the confines of his own tomb. It was not the harsh, yellow light of a candle, nor the cold, silver light of the moon. This was a soft, gentle, and utterly impossible luminescence, a pearlescent, shimmering glow like the inside of a seashell or the light of a distant nebula. It was a cold light, devoid of any warmth, but it was not frightening. It was beautiful, ethereal. It pushed back the darkness, not with force, but with a gentle, insistent persuasion, transforming his cramped, wooden prison into a strange, ethereal cathedral of soft, glowing light. He was no longer afraid. The terror of his impending death, the maddening rhythm of the knocking from next door, it had all faded away, replaced by a profound and dreamlike sense of wonder. He was dying, yes, but he was being granted a final, beautiful vision, a last private miracle. Within this soft, pearlescent light, a form began to take shape. It was a slow, graceful coalescing, as if the light itself were weaving itself into a figure. It was not a sudden apparition, but a gradual becoming. At first, it was just a hazy, indistinct silhouette, a pillar of shimmering light that was slightly more solid than the light around it. Then, slowly, details began to emerge, sketched into being by an unseen, supernatural artist. The form was that of a young woman, tall and slender, her shape defined by the gentle curves of a simple, flowing white dress. She seemed to be floating in the narrow space above him, her feet not touching the bottom of the coffin, her form untroubled by the physical constraints of the box. Then, she turned her head, and Jack's failing heart, which had been slowing to a dull, sluggish beat, seemed to stop altogether, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp, and overwhelming sense of awe and recognition. It was her. It was Molly. It was the face from his memory, but rendered with a clarity and a perfection that no memory could ever hold. The artist of this vision had missed no detail. He saw the gentle curve of her jaw, the small, upturned nose, the dark, graceful sweep of her eyebrows. Her hair, which had been a rich, warm brown in life, was now a cascade of shimmering, silver threads in the ethereal light, and it floated around her head as if she were underwater. She was impossibly, heartbreakingly beautiful, a ghost forged from moonlight and memory. But her beauty was a mask for a profound and terrible sadness. The joyful light that had once danced in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow that seemed to speak of a pain that had lasted for an eternity. Her lips, which he remembered as being quick to smile, were now pale, almost blue, and were set in a line of gentle, unending grief. This was not the vibrant, living Molly he had known. This was her echo. This was the ghost of her sorrow. She floated there, in the silent, glowing confines of his coffin. A silent, beautiful, and tragic apparition. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, her entire being, radiated a sense of shared experience, of a common, terrible fate. Then, she looked directly at him. Her spectral eyes, full of a strange and sorrowful pity, met his. It was a look of profound and deeply unnerving understanding. It was a look that said, "I see you. I know your fear. I know your confinement." It was a silent greeting, a terrible and tragic reunion in the most impossible of circumstances. He was no longer alone in his tomb. He had a visitor, a ghost, come to sit with him in his final moments. He tried to speak her name, to whisper it, but his lungs no longer had the air, his lips no longer had the strength. He could only stare up at her, his own eyes wide with a mixture of wonder, grief, and a resurfacing cold dread. Was this a mercy? Was this a final, comforting vision sent to ease his passing? Or was it something else? Was it a herald? A guide? Sent to lead him from this dark prison into an even darker, more permanent one? The vision was so real, so tangible. He could see the delicate, lace-like pattern on the collar of her white dress, a detail he had long since forgotten. He could see the faint, almost invisible scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall she had once told him about. This was not a hazy, half-formed dream. This was a presence. She was truly, impossibly, with him in the coffin. The air around her, which was already cold, seemed to grow colder still. A sharp, piercing, grave-like chill that was a stark contrast to the gentle, pearlescent light. The beautiful, comforting vision was beginning to show its terrifying, supernatural edge. Then, with a grace that was both fluid and heartbreaking, she began to move toward him. She leaned down, her shimmering, translucent form passing effortlessly through the solid, wooden lid of his coffin, which was, in the logic of this vision, no longer there. The barrier between them, between life and death, between his world and hers, was dissolving. Her sorrowful, beautiful face drew closer and closer to his own, until she was so near he could see the infinite tragic depth in her sad, spectral eyes. She was a breath away. He could feel the profound, deathly cold that emanated from her. A cold that was no longer a comfort, but a terrifying premonition of the eternal cold that awaited him. He was about to be embraced by death itself. This was not a comforting vision. This was his end, personified and made beautiful, and he was powerless to stop its final, gentle, and terrible approach. The spirit of Molly floated inches above him, her presence filling the entire, cramped space of the coffin. The dreamlike wonder that had held Jack in its gentle, passive grip began to evaporate, replaced by a resurgent, ice-cold dread. This was too real. The vision was too perfect, too detailed. The cold emanating from her was too profound. This was no mere dying hallucination, no comforting fantasy conjured by a failing mind. This was a visitation. An actual, supernatural event was unfolding in the final, suffocating moments of his life. He stared up into her face, into the sad, spectral eyes that seemed to hold the weight of a sorrow far older than her few months in the grave. The sense of a shared experience, of a common tragedy, flowed from her in palpable waves. She was not just a ghost who had come to visit him. She was a ghost who understood his predicament with a terrifying, first-hand intimacy. He could see every detail of her face, rendered in the soft, pearlescent light that she herself seemed to generate. He saw the delicate, translucent quality of her skin, like fine porcelain held up to a candle. He saw the faint, bluish tint of her lips, the lips of one whose breath had long since ceased. He saw a flicker of movement in her eyes, not of life, but of a deep, conscious, and eternal awareness. She was here, with him, and she had something to say. With a slow, ethereal grace, she leaned closer still. Her form, a thing of light and memory, passed effortlessly through the unseen barrier of the coffin lid. Her face was now so close to his that if he could have drawn a breath, he would have inhaled the scent of grave cold and winter frost that clung to her. The proximity was both intimate and terrifying. He was being embraced by a phantom, his own failing life force being drawn into her eternal, sorrowful stillness. Her pale, blue lips, which had been set in a line of gentle, passive grief, began to part. The movement was slow, deliberate, and utterly silent. He watched, mesmerized, as she prepared to speak her first and final words to him. He did not know what to expect. A word of comfort? A message for the living? A lament for her own stolen youth? A single, frosty puff of air? visible even in the strange light, escaped her lips. It was the breath of the grave, the cold air of the tomb being given voice. And then a whisper. It was not a sound that traveled through the stale air of the coffin to his ears. It was a thought, a perfect, clear, and chilling sentence that bloomed directly in the center of his mind, as if she had planted it there herself. The voice was hers, the sweet, melodic tone he remembered, but it was flattened, drained of all warmth, a beautiful sound encased in a layer of ancient, glacial ice. "I knew you would come, Jack." The words were a shock, a jolt of pure, cognitive dissonance. "I knew you would come." It was not a greeting of surprise. It was a statement of expectation, as if his arrival here, in this coffin, in this specific forgotten patch of earth, had been foretold. As if she had been waiting for him. But it was the second part of her whispered message that shattered the last, remaining vestiges of his understanding. The words that followed rewrote the entire narrative of his horror, transforming it from a personal, tragic accident into a shared, and infinitely more sinister, fate. "They did this to me too." The four simple words struck him with the force of a physical blow. His mind, already weakened and adrift, struggled to grasp the full, monstrous implication of what she had just said. They did this to me too. The pronoun, they, the same unseen, cruel they who had perpetrated this horror upon him. His friends, the members of the Wonder Club, the men whose drunken, foolish cruelty had led him to this tomb. And the verb, did. The same action, the same fate, the beautiful, tragic story of Molly's death, the story he and all of London had accepted off a sudden, noble sickness, a quick fever, a peaceful passing was a lie, a complete and utter fabrication. The horrifying truth, delivered in a single ghostly whisper, rearranged his entire reality. Molly had not died of a fever. She had been a victim. She, too, had been part of a game, a wager, a dark and terrible secret kept by the very same circle of laughing, privileged young men he had called his friends. Had she, too, made a foolish bet? Had she been betrayed? Had she been deliberately, coldly, and methodically buried alive, just as he had been? The knocking. The thought was a bolt of lightning that illuminated the entire, dark, and hideous landscape of his predicament. The rhythmic, insistent tap, tap, tap from the neighboring coffin. It had not been a hallucination. It had not been a territorial ghoul or a monstrous guardian. It had been her. It had been Molly, trapped in her own coffin, in the eternal darkness, for months. Awake, aware, and alone. She had been knocking, not as a threat, not as a mindless echo, but as a desperate, lonely soul, tapping out a message of her own existence, a futile, heartbreaking plea into the deaf, silent earth. And tonight, when a new victim had been interred beside her, she had knocked again, not in menace, but in recognition, a greeting to the first soul who was close enough to hear her. The full, crushing weight of her tragedy, so much greater and so much longer than his own, descended upon him. He had been suffering for hours. She had been suffering for months, lying in this same suffocating darkness, her mind her only companion, her only activity the slow, patient, and hopeless act of knocking on the wall of her tomb. His own pathetic self-pity evaporated, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of shared damnation. They were victims of the same monstrous secret society, a club that did not just tell stories of horror, but created them. They were the final, discarded wonders of the Wonder Club. He looked again into her sad, spectral eyes, and he saw not just his own fate reflected, but the terrible, lonely history of hers. He understood the depth of her sorrow. He understood the reason for her eternal weeping. She was not just a ghost of a dead girl. She was the ghost of a girl who had been murdered in the cruelest, most drawn-out way imaginable. The vision began to waver. The revelation, the final, terrible truth, seemed to have cost the spirit the last of her energy. Her beautiful, translucent form started to blur at the edges, the pearlescent light that surrounded her flickering and dimming. The connection was breaking. Her face, filled with a final, heartbreaking expression of pity and shared doom, began to recede. Her whispered voice echoed one last time in his mind, no longer a clear sentence, but a fading, sorrowful sigh. As her light vanished, the absolute, suffocating darkness of the coffin rushed back in to reclaim him. The brief, horrifying, and strangely beautiful interlude was over. He was alone again, but he was no longer just a man dying in a box. He was a man who knew the truth. He was the second victim, and as the last of his own strength, his own consciousness, began to ebb away, he knew that his fate was now inextricably linked with hers. To lie here, in the cold, dark earth, side by side, for eternity. The last spark of light in his oxygen-starved brain went out, and his world, and Molly's, faded to black. The vision shattered, not like breaking glass, but like a candle flame being suddenly and violently snuffed out. The beautiful, pearlescent light, the ethereal form of Molly, the heartbreaking intimacy of her terrible confession, it all vanished in an instant. Jack was plunged back into the stark, brutal, and uncompromising reality of his tomb. The darkness that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more absolute than before. The silence was deeper, now filled with the screaming echo of her final, whispered words. His body, which had been floating in a state of dreamlike detachment, came crashing back to a state of agonizing awareness. He could feel the rough, splintered wood against his back and the suffocating pressure of the lid inches from his face. He could feel the burning in his lungs, a fire that was rapidly consuming the last of the poison air. The last of his strength, the last vestiges of his consciousness, were giving way. The sparkling, dying stars of hypoxia were returning, swarming in his vision. A final, beautiful curtain falling on the tragedy of his life. His world, his awareness, his very being was fading to black. And here, in this final, liminal moment, poised on the knife's edge between life and death, between a horrifying reality and an impossible vision, the ultimate, unanswerable question took root in his mind. The question that would define the nature of his own personal hell. Was any of it real? Had he truly been visited by the sorrowful spirit of his lost love? Had she, a fellow victim of an unspeakable cruelty, reached out across the veil of death to offer a final, tragic moment of connection and revelation? Was the story she had whispered into his mind the story of her own premature burial, of the lies told by their so-called friends, the absolute horrifying truth? If so, then his death, while terrible, was not a lonely one. It was a shared fate, a tragic reunion in a subterranean chamber of horrors. He was not just a fool who had died because of a stupid bet. He was a victim of a monstrous conspiracy, and his death was a small part of a larger, darker story. There was a terrible, grim kind of sense to it, a narrative that explained his suffering. Or was there a different, and perhaps even more terrifying, explanation? Was it all a hallucination? Was the entire visitation, the light, the ghostly form, the whispered confession simply the last, desperate fantasy of a dying, oxygen-starved brain? The mind, in its final moments, is known to be a powerful and unreliable narrator. Had his own mind, in a final, merciful act of self-deception, conjured the most beautiful and tragic image it could think of to shield him from the stark, ugly, and meaningless reality of his own death. In this version of reality, Molly had died peacefully of a fever, just as everyone believed. The knocking from the next coffin was just the sound of a root, a shifting stone, or the first auditory hallucination of his failing brain. The vision had not been a message from a fellow soul. It had been a story he told himself, a comforting lie, woven from his own memories, his own guilt, and his desperate need for his suffering to have some kind of meaning. A story that transformed his pathetic, lonely end into a grand, gothic tragedy, making him a romantic, doomed hero instead of a foolish, drunken boy who had been murdered by his friends as a joke. Which reality was worse? To die knowing you are a victim of a shared, supernatural curse, forever bound to the ghost of the woman you once knew? Or to die completely and utterly alone, your only companion a final, elaborate, and self-serving lie? Jack did not have an answer. The two possibilities, the supernatural truth and the psychological lie, began to blur, to weave in and out of each other in his fading consciousness. If the vision was real, then the knocking from the next coffin was Molly. Her spirit, or perhaps her still living, miraculously preserved body, was trapped there, and she had been trying to communicate, her patient tap, tap, tap a lonely beacon in the dark. His arrival was the first time in months she had had a neighbor close enough to hear. Her visitation was a genuine act of spectral communication. But if the vision was a hallucination, then what was the knocking? It had been so real, so persistent. Had his mind created the knocking first, a simple rhythmic hallucination, and then, in its desperate need to explain the sound, had it built the entire elaborate story of Molly's fate around it? Had he unconsciously seized upon the memory of her tragic death and retroactively made her the author of the sound, the protagonist of his personal horror story? In this case, the knocking wasn't her signal. It was his own mind's overture, the first note in the symphony of his own descent into madness. He was lost, adrift in a sea of terrifying possibilities, with no way to know which shore was real. The darkness was absolute. The air was gone. His thoughts began to unravel, the threads of logic and fantasy tangling into an inseparable knot. His final, fading sensation was of the cold, the deep, penetrating, and eternal cold of the grave. And in that cold, he felt a final, ambiguous touch. Was it the spectral, sorrowful caress of Molly's ghostly hand? welcoming him to their shared, eternal prison? Or was it simply the final, cold kiss of his own lonely death? He would never know. His world dissolved into a final, silent, and complete blackness, leaving only the unanswerable question hanging in the void. A man dies in a coffin 6 feet beneath the earth. He dies in terror, but in his final moments, he is granted a vision of tragic, beautiful companionship. Was it a true glimpse into the supernatural world that lies beyond our own? A final, horrifying confirmation that the grave is not the end, but a new and terrible beginning? Or was it simply the last, beautiful, and ultimately meaningless firing of a dying human mind? A ghost story told by a brain to itself as the lights go out for good? The truth of Jack's vision was buried with him, an eternal secret kept by the silent, indifferent earth. Jack's world fades to black, leaving him with a final, chilling vision and an unanswerable question. He found company in the grave, but was she a fellow soul, or just a figment of his own dying mind? Was Molly truly there? And if so, is she still alive, knocking in the eternal dark? Let us know what you think below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.